everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and this is Pepper, and today we are going to be continuing our reading of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. But before we do, I have a little bit of an announcement. My lovely girlfriend, who some of you may have seen if you went back into the playlist and have watched the hot sauce challenge that the two of us did, is an artist. And she, for her own artistic projects, you can find her at Twitter. Her account is princess_sloth, produces stickers for some of her projects. She was kind enough to gift me with a set of stickers for my own personal little project. These are very sweet and I love them dearly, but I haven't yet figured out what I'm going to do with them. So, if you're interested in getting a set of Soft Stories stickers, leave a comment and we can figure out how best to get them to you. I'm excited at the opportunity to have merchandise for this tiny channel, something I never expected in a million years. Lindsay has always been a better advocate for me than I have been for myself. Isn't that always the way with our loved ones? I hope that you too have people in your life that you can rely on to be there for you. At the very least, know that I am here if you ever need to talk or ever need someone to just listen, or someone to listen to. And it is that, with that we enter into our reading for today. I am so enjoying this book. We have learned even more about the enigmatic Captain Nemo, about his life when he was living above the sea, and about his marvelous craft, the Nautilus. Let's see what happens next when we open our book to Chapter 15, A Letter of Invitation. On the next day, November 9th, I awoke after a long 12-hour sleep. Gosh, I wish I could have a 12-hour sleep. As usual, Conseil came in to ask how Monsieur had slept and to offer his services. He had left his Canadian friend sleeping like a man who spent his life doing nothing else, like our lovely friend Pepper back there. I let him chatter on as he pleased, without giving much thought to answering him. I was preoccupied with Captain Nemo's absence during our reunion of the previous afternoon, but I hoped to see him again soon. I quickly got into my clothes made of byssus fabric. Conseil made several comments on them, and I told him they were made from the shiny, silky threads with which the pinner, a kind of oyster-like creature, very common near the shores of the Mediterranean, attaches itself to rocks. In olden days, people used it to make beautiful cloth, stockings and gloves, for it is both very soft and warm. The crew of the Nautilus could, therefore, dress at little cost and without having to take anything from cotton plants, sheep, or silkworms on land. Once dressed, I went to the big lounge. It was empty. I plunged into a study of the valuable shellfish gathered in the glass cases. I also went through the vast collection of rare marine plants, which, although dried out, still conserved their marvellous colours. Among these precious hydrophytes, I noticed some world cladostivae, peacock-like padinae, caulipae shaped like vine leaves, graniphilus calathamion, delicate scarlet-tinted ceramicae, fan-shaped agars, acetabularia looking like the tops of mushrooms, and which for a long time were classified as zoophytes, and finally many different types of sea wrack. The entire day went by without my being honoured by a visit from Captain Nemo. The panels of the lounge never opened. Perhaps he did not want us to become bored with these beautiful things. The Nautilus kept heading east-northeast at a speed of 12 knots and a depth varying between 165 and 200 feet. On the next day, the same neglect and solitude. I saw none of the crew. Ned and Conseil spent most of the day with me. They were astonished at the captain's mysterious absence. Was this strange man sick? Had he changed his mind about what to do with us? But, as Conseil pointed out, we were enjoying complete freedom and good food. Our host was keeping his side of the bargain. We could not complain. And the strangeness of our fate held such fine compensations that we had no right to blame him. That day I started a diary of our adventures, which has since permitted me to recount them with the greatest accuracy. However, there was one peculiar thing about this diary. It was written on paper made from eelgrass. Early in the morning of November 11th, fresh air spreading throughout the inside of the Nautilus told me that we had surfaced in order to renew the oxygen supply. I went to the central companionway and up onto the platform. It was 6 o'clock. The sky was clouded and the sea grey but calm. There was hardly any swell. I was hoping to meet Captain Nemo there, but I had no idea whether or not he would come out on deck. I saw only the helmsman, imprisoned in his glass cage. I sat down on the ledge formed by the dinghy's hull and took deep breaths of the delicious salt air. Little by little, the mist began to lift beneath the sun's rays as it rose over the eastern horizon. The sea flamed like a powder trail under its light. The high, scattered clouds took on bright, delicately shaded colours, and numerous mare's tails, which are little white clouds with scalloped edges, showed that it would be windy all day long. But what was wind to the Nautilus, which could brave any storm? I was admiring this joyous sunrise, so gay and invigorating, when I heard someone climbing up the companionway. I got ready to meet and greet Captain Nemo, but it was the first mate who appeared. I recognized him as being the man who had accompanied the captain when he had first visited us in our cell. He walked forward on the platform without seeming to notice my presence. With a powerful telescope, he very carefully scanned the entire horizon. Then, when this examination was over, he went to the hatch and pronounced the following words. I remember them well, for each morning they were repeated under the same conditions. They were Nortron, Respock, Lorny, Verge. As to what they meant, I had no idea. After uttering these words, the first mate went back inside the ship. I thought that the Nautilus would probably once again dive below the surface, and I therefore went down the hatch and along the gangways to my cabin. 5 days went by like this, without the slightest change in the routine of our lives. Every morning I went up on the platform. The same sentence was uttered by the same man. Captain Nemo did not appear. I had given up hope of seeing him when, on November 16th, as I entered my room along with Ned and Conseil, I found a note lying on my table. I opened it impatiently. The handwriting was clear and neat, but somewhat ornate and in Germanic style. The note read as follows. November 16th, 1867. Professor Aronnax, on board the Nautilus. Captain Nemo has the pleasure of inviting Professor Aronnax on a hunting expedition tomorrow, in his forests of Crespo Island. He hopes no previous engagements will prevent the professor from accepting, and he would be very pleased if his companions would care to join him. Captain Nemo, commander of the Nautilus. A hunting expedition, cried Ned. In these forests of Crespo Island? Added Conseil. Does that mean he sometimes goes on shore? Asked Ned Land. There seems to be little doubt about it, I said, as I reread the letter. Well then, there's nothing to do but accept, said the Canadian. Once we're on dry land, we'll see what we can do. Besides, I wouldn't mind eating a few fresh pieces of venison. I did not even try to understand the contradictions between Captain Nemo's obvious distaste for dry land, even islands, and his invitation to hunt in a forest. I merely answered, let's first see what this Crespo Island is like. I consulted a map, and at 32 degrees 40 minutes north latitude and 167 degrees 50 minutes west longitude, I found a little island which had been first sighted in 1801 by Captain Crespo, and which on old Spanish maps was called Roca de Plata, Silver Rock. We were, therefore, about 1,800 miles from our point of departure, and the Nautilus's slightly altered course was bringing us toward the southwest. I pointed to this little rock lost in the middle of the North Pacific. If Captain Nemo does occasionally go on dry land, I said, he at least chooses islands that are completely deserted. Ned Land shrugged his shoulders without answering, and then he and Conseil left. After supper, served by the same mute, impassive steward, I went to sleep, not without some anxiety. When I awoke on the morning of the next day, November 17th, I could feel that the Nautilus was completely immobile. I got dressed quickly and entered the big lounge. Captain Nemo was there, waiting for me. He got up, bowed, and asked if I would like to accompany him. But, monsieur, I said. First, allow me to ask you one question. Go ahead, Monsieur Aronnax, and I'll answer it if I can. Well then, Captain, how is it that you, who have broken off all relations with dry land, own forests on Crespo Island? Professor, replied the captain, these forests of mine ask neither light nor heat from the sun. They are inhabited by no lions, tigers, panthers, or any quadruped. They are known only to me. They grow only for me. These forests are not on land, but underwater. Underwater forests, I cried. Yes, Professor. And you're offering to take me there? That's right. On foot, without your feet even getting damp. And we're going to hunt. We're going to hunt. With guns. With guns. I looked at the commander of the Nautilus in a way that was not exactly flattering. He's gone out of his mind, I thought. He must have had some sort of an attack that lasted for a week, and he's still under the effects of it. Too bad. I liked him better, peculiar than crazy. These thoughts could be clearly read on my face, but Captain Nemo merely invited me to follow him, which I did, resignedly. We entered the dining room, where breakfast was laid out on the table. Monsieur Aronnax, said the captain, I would like you to have breakfast with me. We can talk while we eat. I promised you a walk through a forest, but I didn't promise I'd find you a restaurant there. So please, eat like a man who won't do so again until late in the day. I did honor to the meal. It was made up of various fish and slices of sea cucumber, seasoned with very appetizing varieties of seaweed, such as Polyphora laciniata and Laurentia prima fatida. As a drink, we had clear water, to which, following the captain's example, I added several drops of a fermented liquor extracted, according to the Kamchatkian method, from a kind of seaweed called Rhodomenia palmata. At first, Captain Nemo ate without saying a word, but then, after a while, he said, Professor, when I invited you to go hunting in my forests of Crespo Island, you thought I was contradicting myself. When I told you these forests were underwater, you thought I was mad. Professor, you should never make hasty judgments about people. But, Captain, believe me. Please listen to what I have to say, and then you'll see whether you were right in accusing me of contradictions or madness. I'm listening. Professor, you know as well as I that a man can live underwater as long as he takes with him a supply of air to breathe. Usually, when men work underwater, they wear a waterproof suit, have their head enclosed in a metal helmet, and receive their air from above by means of force pumps and outlet regulators. That's the normal diving apparatus, I said. But under those conditions, a man isn't free. He's attached by a rubber pipe to the pump sending him air, and this pipe is like a chain binding him to one spot. If he were bound like this to the Nautilus, he could certainly not go very far. But then, how can you be free? I asked. By using a device invented by two of your compatriots, Roux Creole and Teneroux, which I have perfected for my own use, and which will permit a man to venture into new physiological conditions without suffering from any bodily harm. It's composed of a tank with thick steel walls in which I store air at a pressure of 50 atmospheres. This tank is carried on the back by means of straps, like a soldier's pack. At the top, there is a compartment from which the air, held back by a kind of bellows, is released under normal pressure. In the usual Roy Quarrel apparatus, 2 rubber tubes go from this compartment to a mask covering the mouth and nose of the man using it. One is for breathing in fresh air, and the other for exhaling, and the tongue is used to close off one or the other, depending on the user's needs. But for me, since I have to move around under considerable pressure in the ocean depths, I had to have my head enclosed in a copper sphere, somewhat like that of divers, and it is to this helmet that the inhaling and exhaling tubes are connected. Right, Captain, but the air you can take with you must get used up quickly, and once it contains no more than 15% oxygen, it's no longer any good for breathing. That's right. But as I have said, Monsieur Aronnax, the Nautilus's pumps allow me to store air under considerable pressure, and thus I can put enough air in the tanks to last for 9 or 10 hours. I have no further objections to make, I answered. I would only like to know, Captain, how you light your way along the ocean floor. With a Ruhmkorff device, Monsieur Aronnax. The breathing apparatus is carried on the back, whereas this is attached to the belt. It's composed of a Bunsen battery, which is activated not with potassium bichromate, but with sodium. An induction coil gathers the electricity produced and sends it along to a special kind of lantern. Within this lantern, there is a glass tube in the form of a coil, which contains only a residue of carbonic gas. When the apparatus is turned on, this gas becomes luminous, giving off a whitish, continuous light. Thus equipped, I breathe and see perfectly well. Captain Nemo, you have given me such overwhelmingly convincing answers to all my objections that I hardly dare to have any doubts left. But even though I'm forced to believe in your Wukrerol and Ruhmkorff devices, I still have reservations about the gun I'm going to use. But it's not a gun that uses powder, replied the captain. What is it then? An air gun? Of course. How do you expect me to manufacture powder on board when I have neither saltpeter, sulfur, nor charcoal? Besides, I said, in order to shoot underwater, in a medium 855 times denser than air, you'd have to overcome a considerable resistance. That presents no difficulty. There are certain cannons, perfected after Fulton's time by the Englishman Philip Coles and Burley, by the Frenchman Furcy, and by the Italian Landi, which have a device for closing out water, thus making it possible to shoot under such conditions. But let me say again that since I have no powder, I use air instead, under high pressure, abundantly furnished by the Nautilus's pumps. But this air must get used up in no time at all. Yes, but more can be supplied from the tanks on our backs if we need it. All I have to do is add a little special spigot. Besides, you'll see, Monsieur Aronnax, in these underwater hunting expeditions we use little air or bullets. But it still seems to me that in this semi-darkness, and in the midst of this liquid so much denser than air, you can't fire far, and the shells must spend themselves very quickly. Monsieur, with these guns, every shot is fatal, and as soon as an animal is touched, no matter how lightly, he falls down dead. Why? Because these guns don't shoot ordinary bullets, but little glass capsules invented by the Austrian chemist Leinebrock, and I have a large stock of them. These glass capsules are covered with a steel case and weighted with lead. Thus, they are veritable little Leyden jars, into which electricity has been forced under very high tension. At the slightest blow they discharge, and the animal, however large he may be, falls dead. In addition, these capsules are no larger than size 4 shot, and an ordinary gun could be loaded with 10 of them. I'll argue no more, I replied, getting up from the table. There's nothing left for me but to take up my gun. Wherever you go, I'll go too. Captain Nemo led me to the stern of the Nautilus. As we passed Ned and Conseil's cabin, I called them, and they immediately fell in behind us. We then came to a kind of cell up against the ship's side near the engine room. It was there that we put on our costumes. Chapter 16. A Walk Across the Plains. This cell was both the arsenal and the dressing room of the Nautilus. A dozen diving outfits were hanging on the wall, waiting for us. When Ned Land saw them, he showed an obvious distaste at the idea of putting them on. "But Ned," I said, "these forests of Crespo Island are under water." "Yes, I know," said the harpooner, disappointed at seeing his dreams of fresh meat vanish. "But you, Monsieur Aronnax, are you going to put on that outfit?" "I've got to, Ned." "Do whatever you want, Monsieur," replied the harpooner, shrugging his shoulders. "But as for me, I'll never get into clothes like that unless they force me to." "Nobody's going to force you to, Ned," said Captain Nemo. "Is Conseil going to try it?" asked Ned. "I follow, Monsieur, wherever he goes," answered Conseil. At a call from the captain, 2 men from the crew came over to help us put on these heavy, waterproof suits, made of seamless rubber and constructed in such a way as to be able to bear up under considerable pressure. It was like strong yet supple armor. The suit consisted of trousers and a jacket. The trousers ended in thick shoes equipped with heavy lead soles. The fabric of the jacket was held firm by copper plates which protected the chest against the water pressure and allowed the lungs to function freely. Its sleeves ended in gloves that were supple enough for the wearer to perform any normal operations with his hands. As one can see, these highly perfected diving costumes were a far cry from the bulky outfits such as the cork breastplates, the special sea clothes, the boxers, etc., which were invented and praised during the 18th century. Captain Nemo, one of his companions, a kind of Hercules who must have had incredible strength, Conseil, and I soon finished putting on our diving suits. We were completely outfitted except for our metal helmets. But before putting these on, I asked Captain Nemo's permission to examine one of the guns we were going to use. A member of the Nautilus's crew handed me a rather ordinary-looking rifle with a steel butt, which was hollow inside and fairly large. This was the reservoir containing the compressed air, which a trigger-operated valve released into the chamber. A magazine, hollowed out in the side walls of the butt, contained some 20 electric bullets, which were automatically placed in the chamber by means of a spring. As soon as one shot had been fired, a second was ready to go off. "Captain Nemo," I said, "this weapon seems both perfect and easy to operate. I ask only to try it out. But how are we going to get out onto the ocean floor?" "Right now, the Nautilus is sitting on the bottom at a depth of 30 feet, and we have only to be on our way." "But how are we going to get out?" "You'll see." Captain Nemo put on his spherical helmet. Conseil and I did the same, not without first hearing the Canadian sarcastically wish us good hunting. The top part of our jackets ended in a threaded copper collar, onto which the metal helmet could be screwed. 3 holes, covered by thick glass, permitted us to see in any direction, merely by turning our heads inside the helmet. As soon as we were completely dressed, the Roy Querol devices were placed on our backs. They began to work at once, and, as for me, I found breathing very easy. Then, with the Ruhmkorff lamp at my belt and the gun in my hand, I was ready to leave. But I felt imprisoned in these heavy clothes, and nailed to the deck by my lead soles. I was unable to take a single step. But they had foreseen this difficulty, and I felt myself being helped into a little compartment adjoining the dressing room. My companions were also helped along, and entered right behind me. I heard a watertight door close behind us, and we were enveloped in total darkness. After several minutes, a loud whistling noise reached my ears. I could feel something cold rising from my feet to my chest. Evidently, someone inside the submarine had opened a spigot, allowing the outside water to flood the room we were in. It was soon filled, and a second door in the hull of the Nautilus opened. A dim light entered. A moment later, we were walking on the ocean floor. And now, how can I describe my impressions of this walk beneath the surface of the ocean? Words are powerless to recount such marvels. When the painter's brush cannot even reproduce the effects produced by water, how can the pen hope to succeed? Captain Nemo walked out in front, and his companion followed several paces behind us. Conseil and I stayed near one another, as if it might have been possible to talk through the metal around our heads. I no longer felt the weight of my clothing, shoes, and air tank, nor of the thick helmet inside which my head bobbed around like an almond inside its shell. All these objects, once in the water, lost a part of their weight equal to the amount of water displaced, and I found I was profiting greatly by the law Archimedes had discovered. I was no longer an inert mass, but had a relatively great freedom of movement. I was astounded to see how much light reached the ocean floor, 30 feet below the surface. The sun's rays easily penetrated this liquid mass, and they made it seem transparent. I could see objects clearly at 100 yards. Beyond that, the ocean depths were tinted with delicate shades of ultramarine, which turned to a purer blue as the distance got greater, and then disappeared in the midst of a vague shadowiness. Indeed, this water surrounding me was no more than another kind of air, denser than the atmosphere, but almost as transparent. I could see the calm surface of the sea above me. We walked over fine-grained sand, without the ripples one finds on beaches where the tide has left its mark. This dazzling carpet acted as a reflector, sending back the sun's rays with surprising intensity. As a result, there was an immense reverberation of light which penetrated each liquid molecule. Will the reader believe me if I state that at this depth of 30 feet I could see as well as if I were in broad daylight? For a quarter of an hour I walked over this blazing sand, strewn with an almost imperceptible dust from shells. The hull of the Nautilus, looking like a long reef, disappeared little by little, but its searchlight, once night had come over the ocean floor, would facilitate our return by throwing out its strong, clear beams. This phenomenon is difficult to understand for someone who has only seen a searchlight's clearly outlined, whitish rays on land. There, the dust saturating the air gives them the appearance of a luminous mist, but on water, as well as underwater, their electric gleam is transmitted with incomparable purity. But we kept on walking, and the vast sandy plain seemed unending. With my hand I parted liquid curtains which closed in again behind me, and the trace of my footsteps was quickly erased by the pressure of the water. Soon, some objects looming up in the distance became visible. I recognized a magnificent foreground of rocks covered with splendid specimens of zoophytes, and I was mainly struck with a very special effect produced by the medium we were in. It was then 10 in the morning. The sun's rays struck the surface at a rather oblique angle, and refracted by this contact, as if passing through a prism, they tinted the edges of flowers, rocks, plants, shells, and corals with the 7 colors of the solar spectrum. It was a marvelous feast for the eyes. Colors crisscrossed one another in a veritable kaleidoscope of green, yellow, orange, violet, indigo, and blue, the entire palette of the enthusiastic colorist. How I would have liked to describe to Conseil the impression this made on me, and compete with him in uttering phrases of wonder. How I would have enjoyed, like Captain Nemo and his companion, being able to exchange thoughts by means of previously arranged signals. So, for lack of anything better, I talked to myself, shouting inside my copper helmet, and perhaps wasting more air than I should have with these vain words. Conseil and I both stopped to admire this marvelous spectacle. Confronted by so many specimens of zoophytes and mollusks, he was obviously classifying. The ground was covered with polyps and echinoderms, different kinds of Isidae, Cunularia, which live in isolation, tufts of virgin oculinae, formerly called white coral, bristling fungi shaped like mushrooms, and sea anemones, holding on to rocks with their muscular discs, all formed a flower bed, dotted with porpitae, dressed in their collars of azure tentacles, starfish studding the sand, varicosed asterophytons, which looked like delicate lace embroidered by the hands of water nymphs, and whose borders moved gently in the eddies produced by our walking. I hated the thought of squashing beneath my feet the brilliant specimens of mollusks which were strewn over the ground by the thousands, concentric comb shells, hammer shells, wedge shells, which can actually jump, top shells, red helmet shells, wing shells, and so many other products of the inexhaustible ocean. But we had to keep going, and as we walked, we could see swimming overhead schools of Portuguese man-o'-war, with their ultramarine blue tentacles trailing along behind them. Jellyfish, with their milky white or delicate pink bodies edged around with blue, all shading us from the sun's rays. And Panapharae Pelagiae, which in the darkness would have strewn our path with their phosphorescence. For a quarter of a mile, these wonders continued. Whenever I stopped to admire them, Captain Nemo would motion for me to keep moving, and I would have to set out again. But soon, the ground changed. The plain sand was followed by an area of slimy mud, which in America is called ooze, entirely composed of siliceous and calcareous shells. We then crossed a prairie of seaweed, oceanic plants which had not yet been uprooted by the force of the water, and which were growing in wild profusion. This thick, soft lawn would have rivaled the most velvety carpet woven by the hand of man. However, there were plants not only underfoot, but also overhead. A light arbor of marine plants, classified in the luxuriant family of the algae, in which there are more than 2,000 species, crisscrossed the surface. I could make out long ribbons of sea wrack, some globular and others tubular, Lawrencii, Cladostephae with their slender foliage, and some dulse, which looked like cactus ferns. I noticed that the green plants remained nearer the surface, while those coloured red occupied a medium depth, leaving the black or brown hydrophytes to form the gardens and flower beds on the deeper parts of the ocean floor. These algae are a real prodigy of creation, one of the marvels of universal plant life. This family produces both the smallest and largest plants on Earth. Of the smallest kinds, as many as 40,000 have been counted within the space of 1/25th of a square inch, whereas sea wrack has been found measuring almost 1/3 of a mile in length. It was about an hour and a half since we had left the Nautilus. It was now almost noon. I could see this by the right angle at which the sun's rays entered the water, and by the fact that they were no longer refracted. The magical colours had disappeared little by little, and the emerald and sapphire-like nuances had vanished from our world. We walked with a steady step which resounded on the ocean floor with surprising intensity. The slightest noises were transmitted with a speed to which our land-trained ears were unaccustomed. Water, in fact, is a better conductor of sound than air, and carries it 4 times as fast. Just then, the ground began to slope sharply downward. The light became uniformly shaded. We reached a depth of 300 feet and a pressure of 10 atmospheres. But my diving suit was so constructed that this pressure caused me no discomfort. The only unpleasant sensation I experienced was in trying to bend my fingers, but even this soon disappeared. As for the fatigue I should have felt after walking 2 hours in such an unaccustomed costume, I felt nothing. The water helped me to move with surprising ease. At this depth, I could still make out the sun's rays, but only feebly. Their brilliant intensity had given way to a kind of reddish dusk, halfway between day and night. Nevertheless, we could still see our way clearly, and it was not yet necessary to start using our Ruhmkorff lamps. Just then, Captain Nemo stopped. After waiting for me to catch up to him, he pointed to several dark masses outlined in the shadows a short way off. That must be the forest of Crespo Island, I thought. And I was right. Chapter 17. An Underwater Forest. We had finally arrived at the edge of this forest, undoubtedly one of the most beautiful in all of Captain Nemo's vast domain. He considered it his own, and claimed the same rights over it as had the first men at the beginning of time. Moreover, who was going to dispute his ownership of this underwater property? What braver pioneer was going to come with an axe and clear away these dark groves? This forest was composed of large, tree-like plants, and as soon as we had gone under its vast arches, I was struck by the strange shape of their branches, a shape I had never seen before. None of the grass covering the ground or any of the branches attached to the trees was inclined, bent, or in any way horizontal. Everything rose toward the surface. There were no filaments or ribbons, no matter how thin, which weren't standing as straight as ramrods. Due to the density of the element which had produced them, sea wrack and creepers grew in a rigid, vertical line. They were normally motionless, but when I pushed them aside with my hand, they immediately went back to their original position. This was the reign of the vertical. I soon became accustomed to this peculiar arrangement of things, as well as to the relative darkness which surrounds us. The forest floor was strewn with sharp rocks which were difficult to avoid. The plant life here seemed quite complete, richer than it would have been in the Arctic or tropical zones, where such products are less numerous. But for several minutes I involuntarily confused the two kingdoms, mistaking zoophytes for hydrophytes, animals for plants. But who would have not made the same mistake? Fauna and flora are so closely related to one another in this underwater world. I noticed that all the specimens of the vegetable kingdom were only lightly held to the ground, without roots, and not caring whether they are fixed to something solid, sand, shells, or pebbles. They only ask of the ground for something to hang on to, not for their life's blood. These plants are self-propagating and derive their existence from the water which sustains and nourishes them. Most of them had, instead of leaves, whimsically shaped blades in a narrow range of colors, comprising only pink, carmine, green, olive, tan, and brown. I now saw, but no longer dried out like the specimens in the Nautilus, some padinae spread out fan-shaped like a peacock's tail, as if to catch the breeze. Scarlet-coloured Ceramyceae, laminaria, stretching out their edible shoots, slender, wavy Nererocytes, growing to a height of 50 feet. Bunches of Acetabula, whose stems grew thicker at the top, and many other deep-sea plants, all without flowers. What a strange and peculiar world, as one clever naturalist put it, where the animal kingdom flowers, and the vegetable kingdom doesn't. Among these various shrubs, as big as the trees of temperate zones, and beneath their damp shadows, were mashed together real bushes of living flowers, hedges of zoophytes, on which blossomed stripe meanderae, with their twisting furrows, yellowish caryophyllae, with transparent tentacles, and tufts of zoantharia. And, to complete the illusion, fish flies flew from branch to branch like a flock of hummingbirds, while yellow lepisacanthae, with bristling jaws and pointed scales, dactylopteridae, and monocentridae rose at our feet like a flock of snipe. Toward 1 in the afternoon, Captain Nemo gave the signal to halt. I was rather pleased to stop, and we stretched out under a bower of alariae, with their long ribbons shooting out as straight as arrows. This short rest delighted me. Nothing was lacking but the charm of conversation, but it was impossible to talk. I brought my large copper helmet near Conseil's. I saw his eyes shining with joy, and to show his satisfaction, he bobbled his head around inside his helmet in the most comical way imaginable. I was very surprised not to feel very hungry after walking for 4 hours. I had no idea what caused my stomach to react this way. But on the other hand, as happens with all divers, I felt an uncontrollable desire to sleep. Soon my eyes closed behind their thick glass windows, and I fell into a deep slumber, which till then I had been able to fight off merely by walking. I was thus merely following the example of Captain Nemo and his powerful companion, who had already stretched out and gone to sleep. There was no way of knowing how long I dozed, but when I awoke it seemed as if the sun were sinking toward the horizon. Captain Nemo had already gotten up, and I was beginning to stretch my limbs when an unexpected sight brought me quickly to my feet. Only a few steps away, a monstrous spider crab, 3 feet high, was eyeing me, ready to jump. Although my diving suit was thick enough to protect me from his bite, I could not help shuddering with horror. Just then, Conseil and the sailor from the Nautilus awoke. Captain Nemo pointed out the hideous crab to his companion, who knocked it down with one blow of his rifle butt, and I watched the monster's claws writhe in terrible convulsions. This encounter made me think that even more fearful animals must inhabit these dark depths, animals against which my suit would not be thick enough to protect me. Until now this had not occurred to me, and I resolved to be on my guard. Moreover, I supposed that this halt had marked the end of our walk, but I was wrong, and instead of returning to the Nautilus, Captain Nemo continued his daring excursion. The ground continued falling off, but at an even greater angle, taking us deeper and deeper. It must have been around 3 o'clock when we reached a depth of about 500 feet in a narrow valley between high vertical walls. Thanks to the perfection of our diving equipment, we were thus going 300 feet deeper than men had ever gone before. I say 500 feet, even though no instrument permitted me to calculate this depth. But I know that even in the clearest water, the sun's rays penetrate no deeper. And just then, the darkness had become almost complete. 10 steps away, I could see nothing. I was therefore walking, groping my way along, when I suddenly saw a bright white light shining ahead. Captain Nemo had just turned on his electric lamp. His companion did the same. Conseil and I followed their example. By turning a screw, I connected the coil to a glass spiral, and the sea, lit by our 4 lanterns, was illuminated within a radius of 80 feet. Captain Nemo continued on into the obscure depths of the forest, whose shrubs were getting scarcer and scarcer. I noticed that vegetable life disappeared quicker than animal life. Deep-sea plants were already abandoning the soil, which was becoming increasingly arid, but it was still swarming with animals. Zoophytes, articulata, mollusks, and fish. As we walked, I thought that the light from our Ruhmkorff lamps would necessarily attract some inhabitants of these dark depths. But if they did approach, it was never near enough for us to shoot them. Several times I saw Captain Nemo stop, put his gun to his shoulder, and then, after a moment, bring it down again and continue on his way. Finally, at about 4 o'clock, this marvelous excursion came to an end. A huge, magnificent wall of rock rose before us, a heap of gigantic blocks, and enormous, unclimbable granite cliffs, hollowed out with dark caves. This was the edge of Crespo Island. This was land. Captain Nemo stopped suddenly. He motioned for us to halt, and as much as I would have liked to try and climb this wall, I too had to stop. Here ended Captain Nemo's domains. He did not want to go any further. Beyond lay that part of the globe on which he was never again to set foot. We began the return trip. Captain Nemo had again taken the lead, and continued walking forward without hesitation. It seemed to me that we were not returning to the Nautilus by the same path. This new route, very steep and difficult, brought us quickly up toward the surface. Nevertheless, this return to the upper layers of the ocean was not so sudden as to bring about too quick a decompression, which would have done us serious injury and produced those internal lesions so fatal to divers. Very soon the light reappeared and grew stronger, and since the sun was already low on the horizon, the refraction again edged every object with a rainbow-like border. At a depth of 30 feet, we walked amid a swarm of little fish of all kinds, more numerous than birds in the air and also more agile. But no underwater game worthy of a shot had yet met our gaze. Just then, I saw the captain quickly shoulder his gun and follow something moving among the shrubbery. He fired. I heard a faint hissing sound, and an animal fell dead several feet away. It was a magnificent sea otter, an enhydris, the only quadruped that lives entirely in the ocean. This one was 5 feet long and must have been very valuable. Its fur, chestnut brown on top and silver underneath, was of the kind so sought after on the Russian and Chinese market. Its quality and luster would have made it worth at least $400. I looked admiringly at this strange animal, with its round head and short ears, its large eyes and cat-like whiskers, its clawed, webbed feet and tufted tail. This precious carnivore, hunted and tracked by fishermen, is becoming increasingly rare, and it has taken refuge mainly in the North Pacific, from which it will probably soon disappear completely. Captain Nemo's companion came over to take the animal. He put it on his shoulder, and once again we started on our way. For an hour, a sandy plain stretched out before us. Often it rose to within 6 feet of the surface. I could then see our image clearly reflected on the surface, but in reverse. Above us, there was an identical band of men, exactly reproducing our movements and gestures, with the only difference that it was walking upside down, its feet in the air. I also noticed another strange effect. Thick clouds passed by, forming and disappearing rapidly. But when I thought it over, I realized that these so-called clouds were merely due to the varying height of the water in the midst of a groundswell. And when I looked carefully, I could see the foam breaking on its crests and spreading over the surface. I could even see the shadows of large birds overhead as they came down and skimmed the water. It was then that I witnessed one of the finest shots that has ever thrilled a hunter. We could clearly make out a large bird with broad wing spread soaring in our direction. Captain Nemo's companion raised his gun and fired when it was only several feet above the surface. The animal fell dead, and the force of its fall brought it within the hunter's grasp. It was a magnificent albatross, a splendid specimen of these ocean-going birds. But this incident did not interrupt our march. For 2 hours we crossed sandy plains, alternating with prairies of seaweed in which it was very difficult to walk. I was at the end of my strength when we finally saw a vague glimmer piercing the darkness of the water a half a mile away. It was the Nautilus's light. We would be on board within 20 minutes, and once there I could again breathe comfortably, for I felt that the air now furnished by my tank was very low in oxygen. But I had not reckoned with an encounter with something that would delay our arrival. I was 20 paces behind when I saw Captain Nemo turn and run toward me. With his powerful arms he pushed me down, while his companion did the same to Conseil. At first I did not know what to make of this sudden attack, but I was reassured by seeing the captain lie down next to me and remain immobile. I was, therefore, stretched out on the ground, sheltered by a shrub of seaweed, when I raised my head and saw some huge shapes swirl past, leaving streams of phosphorescence behind them. The blood froze in my veins. I saw we were being threatened by 2 formidable dogfish, those terrible sharks with enormous tails and dull, glassy eyes, who secrete a phosphorescent substance through holes around their snouts. They are like monstrous fireflies who can crush an entire man in their jaws of iron. I don't know if Conseil was busy classifying them, but as for me, I was observing their silver bellies and huge mouths bristling with teeth from a not altogether scientific point of view, rather as a prospective victim than as a naturalist. Very fortunately, these voracious animals have bad eyesight. They passed by without seeing us, letting their brownish tails brush against us, and as if by a miracle, we escaped a danger surely greater than that of meeting a tiger in the jungle. A half an hour later, guided by the electric light, we reached the Nautilus. The outside door had been left open, and once we were inside the first compartment, Captain Nemo closed this door behind us. Then he pressed a button. I could hear pumps working inside the submarine. I felt the water level lowering around me, and in a few moments the compartment was entirely empty. The inside door was opened, and we stepped into the dressing room. There, Our diving suits were taken off, although not without some difficulty, and I, exhausted and dying of hunger, went to my room in a state of wonder at our extraordinary excursion into the ocean depths. And that, my friends, is where we will leave it off for today. I apologize again for my assured mispronunciations of many of the Latinate terms that are used in this book. I do my best, I promise. I did love that last chapter, though, or those last two chapters that detailed the adventures outside the sea. It's often sort of difficult to realize that at the time when this book was written, things like scuba diving, which we may not have experienced ourselves but at least know about today, were concepts that would have blown the minds of the readers of this book in 1867, the way that the grandest science fiction does to us today. Like the Starship Enterprise wing its way through space at warp 9, the ability to walk beneath the waves, travel without aid of any ship or additional manpower, and to see the wonders of the deep firsthand is an amazing thing to think of. And it's something that I still find inspiring to this day. The images presented in these chapters are very evocative to me, and I hope that you too have enjoyed this first excursion outside the Nautilus. I look forward to seeing what comes next. Thank you all for joining me today on Soft Stories. And before I leave you, I will just present again these two lovely sticker designs, which I am so excited about. One is our lovely logo, and the other depicts my lovely co-host, Pepper, who seems as dozy in real life as she does in sticker form. Again, I'm still not quite sure what we're going to do with these stickers, but I have quite a few of them, so we'd better make some good use of them. Please let me know what your thoughts are about how to get these out to those who might be interested, and I'm sure we can arrange a giveaway of some kind. I have been very bad about promoting this channel through social media and other avenues. Perhaps a giveaway of these is just the push I need. So please, reach out and give me your thoughts, and we'll figure something out. But that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining me for this reading of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I must leave you now. But until next we meet, Pepper and I wish you all the best, and goodbye.